it was worth their while to take down those massive 2 or 3 Chinese kingdoms. It was not worth their while to go through the 500 petty dukedoms of Europe. And that's sort of the point of this book, is that the fact that Europe wasn't unified helped Europe survive, helped Europe develop.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I'm Murray, in charge of podcasting, and with me as always is Robert, in charge of politics. How are you this time?
I'm doing well, Rory. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Are you still on your holidays, it looks?
Yeah, I am looking out at a lake up in here in sunny northern Michigan. It's always a bit of a crapshoot when you come up to Michigan in September. It can either be you feel like late fall, or it can be the most beautiful days of summer. And I've been lucky in that I've gotten both of those up here.
Okay.
So yeah.
How did your swimming in the pond go?
Oh, it's going well, man. I'm getting up to almost, I think tomorrow I'll go swim for an hour. And it's the lake's actually getting warmer, which it doesn't typically do over the course of September. So feeling pretty lucky with that.
That's all very good to hear. But I'm a little bit concerned with, people like to compare America to Rome, and having everything all balanced on 7 big companies can have its issues.
Yeah, it's not great. It's not great.
Because the Magnificent Seven have added another 7 to their magnificentness.
So these are the 7 biggest tech companies. And
So
what do you
like
mean
is a Tesla, Alphabet, which is Google, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA. There's one there I'm missing, I think.
Microsoft maybe? Or
Microsoft, yeah.
the-
They are
the
now
old one?
7% of US GDP.
Wow, that's great.
And I think 10 years ago they were 1%.
That's great. And of course, all of this is based on the idea that AI is going to be this. It's not just that AI is going to be big and economically significant, which I could. I'm believing less, but I think is plausible. No. This valuation is based on the idea that these companies are about to produce an electronic god.
Yes,
and it's just not gonna happen. So it's the continued. I think we've been talking about how distressing it is, how economically powerful and systemically important these companies are for a while now, and passing another milestone it doesn't make me happy. Right?
I think another terrifying thing about AI investment is I think it overtook like consumer spending.
It overtook consumer spending.
So more money is being invested into AI than America will spend in that time. So the consumer market, which is a terrifying thought.
Yeah. And
because it's one of those things that could just get switched off like any crash to say, nope, this bubble's burst. Don't invest in it.
Yeah, it's really quite extraordinary. I mean, what we should be thinking about, if we were sensible, is what are we going to do with all of these computing resources when the crash happens? Because actually, there's some historical precedent for like we can do some amazing stuff. Like, are you like 4 people sitting in the middle of nowhere who want to like create the next massive video game company? Well, all of this technology resources and all of this cloud space is completely open for you because nobody's doing AI anymore. I think I could get this wrong, but I think the launch of YouTube and video streaming services is from exactly this dynamic.
Oh, it was because there was a lot of cheap hardware from the dot-com bubble or something?
One of the last phases of the dot-com bubble was everybody started getting really excited about and pouring money into, I believe, I could have the technology wrong here, but I believe like fiber optic cable companies.
Okay.
So they laid down, they became very, very big companies with very high valuations. They had a lot of money to play with. They laid down all of this massive infrastructure. And as just one aspect of the initial dot-com collapse in 2000, all of a sudden there was nothing to put on that, all that infrastructure that they'd built. And that infrastructure eventually was all used up by the rise of YouTube and other video streaming services. So that's an interesting positive story. Yeah, it's an interesting positive story. What is going to happen with all of these resources when everybody realizes that we're not actually building electronic God.
Because I'm not sure what you can do with these NVIDIA chips outside of AI. Because one weird thing about the crypto mining is those graphics cards, apparently it wasn't too hard on the cards, and they were just normal consumer graphics cards, so they could be used for architects or for gaming, while these AI ones are bespoke and they're like 20 grand a piece. Obviously if they've been used for several years they'll be cheaper, but yeah, it's possible if people just had lots of AI hardware to play about with in a civilian capacity, wonderful things could come from it, but it's looking scary at this moment in time.
Yeah, well, I'm looking for silver linings here, Rory.
Do you
But
think it could bring down the fall of America and bring about a new dark age?
So we're talking about if we're talking about collapse, that is a nice segue into the book that I want to talk about today, which is Escape from Rome by Walter Scheidel. I've actually read this book twice.
Wow, it's a thick book. Sorry, you've
Yeah,
just shown the top of it.
it is a thick book and it is a complicated book. It's I read some books more quickly and more slowly. This is a book that I read slowly, but it is just fascinating because of the way that this guy thinks about some really central questions.
So could you please explain to the audiences as if I, because I know all about it, as if I've
Yeah.
only found out that this is what we're talking about an hour ago.
Yes, if only that were the case. We'll roll with that. We'll roll with that possibility. It's like you didn't read the emails or
Hmm.
something. Yes, yes.
I read it.
Um,
Well, I seen something and then
yeah, yeah.
exaggerated.
That's all right. No, you had Rory had a very good idea that we should talk about a book that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks that I have not had the chance to read yet. So this book is fascinating, and it is sort of it's an incredibly ambitious book, but what's striking to me, honestly, is the way that this guy manages to follow up on his ambition. And it's part of kind of like a broader question, which is how do you make studying the classics, studying Rome and Greece relevant to just relevant and fundable, and like, how do you make it seem important and worthwhile? And this guy, Walter Scheidel, and Ian Morris both work at Stanford University. And it is an interesting, we've talked a fair amount about Stanford and Silicon Valley. And it's interesting to think about the ways that this sort of weird little school of thought, a couple classics professors, maybe more, working at Stanford University, who have found a way to take their very niche interest. Classics is the study of the ancient civilizations of Greece and Rome. Perhaps there's a more complicated and academic definition to that, but that's what classics is my understanding. And it's also the classics is, at the core of classic Western, European, American liberal arts education. It's sort of what started Renaissance humanism or what have you. A term I've realized is not the best term, and I feel bad for using it. I
Hmm.
apologize to Ada Palmer. But anyway, it's like at the core of education, historically in the United States and Europe, and it's kind of falling out of fashion. And it's very interesting that Walter Scheidel and Ian Morris, two classicists working at Stanford University, which is basically at the heart of Silicon Valley, to tie it back to the Big Seven, have found a way to kind of pitch this as actually one of the most important things to possibly look at. Ian Morris wrote a book called Why the West Has Won for Now, which I think I might have even recommended that on my website or whatnot. And it's a much less serious book that does the same thing that this one does, which is basically look at the history of Rome and compare it with the history of China. And what Ian Morris does is he sort of goes through the past 2,000 years, and I find it deeply unserious, but
Okay.
he was able to sell a bunch of books off of it, and more power to him. And it was interesting. It was very interesting to me. It's sort of like a video gamification of all of history. And Ian Morris came up with a set of numbers. He basically attempted to assign scores to, like, this is
Wow.
the sophistication of, judged on this, this, and this. I'm going to give you a civilizational sophistication score of 62 or something like that. And he had like 5 or 6 separate metrics. And honestly, to me, it just seems like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
It doesn't strike me as like
But also
serious.
suggests if certain archaeological evidence hasn't been found that you get scored really low when actually you might have been incredible.
Yeah, oh, for sure. So, and it's not like Ian Morris was like, this is the be all and end all. Things can change, and there's a bunch of different metrics that go into it. And what is interesting about what he develops, though, it does feel kind of like video game or sort of role playing game to me, is that he sort of would track like, well, at this point, actually, China was more impressive and more sophisticated, but then say the Mongols came in, and then actually Europe was more, and like it's sort of vacillating and this, that, and the other thing. And that's a really interesting book, and I'd recommend it. Ian Morris kind of ended up annoying me because he had this book talking about the value of war. And how, which I think is actually makes some pretty good empirical points, which is that, which Walter Scheidel would agree with, is that war has functioned as like a forcing function throughout human history, in that civilizations that are more exposed to war and have to prepare for warfare for extended periods of time are more likely to advance further. I think that's a very defensible position to make. Ian Morris annoyed me with the book he wrote in 2014, which sort of in the last chapter basically said, and that's why we need to fund NATO more, and that's why we need
Okay.
bigger defense budgets, and like that's why we need to get super excited about war with China. This is my paraphrasing. It's not exactly how he put it, of course.
But it was heavily implied.
I got a little irritated at Ian Morris after that, after being quite a big fan. And Walter Scheidel is his colleague. Scheidel cites Morris many times in this. Actually, takes issue with some of the things that Ian Morris says in this. But I would say this is probably a more serious treatment of the question of why did Rome and China develop in very similar ways for
Hmm.
the period that Rome existed, and then why did Europe escape from Rome, and why had things been so very different on the European side of the Eurasian landmass since 5 or 600 or so from China.
One theory I'd heard is like China is quite like a uniformed landmass, so it's
Mm-hmm.
quite common for one sort of group to sort of dominate just that area quite quickly,
Mm-hmm.
while Europe is a bit weird. Like no one's conquered all of Europe. There's always been like Scandinavia and Germany or the Iberian
Mm-hmm.
Peninsula. Like you only ever seem to get bits of it because its geography is just sort of quite strange or weird. Does he mention that in this book at
Are
all?
you are you sure you didn't read the book, Rory? Because
I'm
that
certain.
is absolutely one of the many factors that
Okay.
he mentions. The fact that he's very concerned with the prominence of the Eurasian steppe, which runs from the top of northern China all the way across this vast
To
swath.
like Ukraine?
Yeah, pretty much to Hungary. Yeah. Or I think there's like maybe a mountain range, and then Hungary's got another little bit of steppe land.
Because I heard it's like it was a place where you could like live kind of like nomadic herdsmen. So you could constantly like instead of like planting crops, you could
Mhm.
live off like a herd of horses or whatever, and like
Mhm.
eat cheese, have milk, and eat the
Mhm.
horses, and you could live like a strange sort of like meat based lifestyle, which I
A
think.
strange meat-based I mean, that's the way a lot of people have lived for
Oh
all of
yes,
human
yes.
history,
I,
but
I
yeah.
I understand,
Yeah,
but to us nowadays
mhm.
it seems strange. But yes, I think the Mongols would have epitomized this lifestyle.
So what's interesting, or many things that is interesting about this book is that sort of the initial centuries back 2,000, 3,000 years ago, where we had the beginnings of imperial formation in all, on around the steppeland, it actually wasn't. The steppes weren't all powered important. What made the steppes super important and super threatening and super inspiring of the kinds of development of societal sophistication necessary to create the armies and defenses against them is that the steppe people got a lot better at dealing with horses
Hmm.
and became this very intimidating military force. And, it seemed like on every page of this thing, there was some detail that explained a ton. Specifically, the one that it calls to mind is that, with one single exception, I think with the only exception being the Ming Dynasty, every consolidating force in Chinese history has come from the north,
Hmm.
because these are the Chinese that have been, toughened up by fighting the steppe nomads who come rushing in. So it's always, I mean, this is why Beijing is in the north, even though perhaps you have richer parts of China further south, Shanghai. This is perhaps true now, but also historically. But it's always, at least for hundreds of years at this point, it's been Beijing or other northern actors that are closer to the steppe that become the consolidating forces. That's just one dynamic. I think it's important to what Scheidel does is he very effectively puts the story of Rome at the center of everything that has mattered very cleverly because he's a classicist. I assume this guy speaks Latin and Greek, and he before, he's probably in his 50s or 60s, and before he started writing much more ambitious things like this that try to explain all of the world history, he did a lot of like detailed work on like on much more narrower subjects related to the history of Rome. And the way that he puts Rome at the center is by talking about the concept of the Great Divergence. Have you heard, and revising that in an interesting way? Have you heard of the topic
I
of the
haven't
Great
heard of the
Divergence?
Great Divergence, no.
So this is one of the most important questions in history, which you've heard that before 1800 or before 1700, India and China were the richest countries
Mhm.
and had
Yeah.
I don't know whatever 50% or 60% of all world industry or I'm not, these numbers are just for rhetorical effect. So what happened? Why did Europe rise? Why was there this great divergence? So that's what it was in 1800, but by 1900, Europe and the United States had 80% of all the industrial productivity and all of this and that and the other thing. So why was there this incredible shift between the success of Asia and Europe? What happened? So that's the great divergence, and that is certainly for decades now, that's been a real topic of discussion in sociology, in history, in political science, I don't know. And there's a lot of what most of those, it's not a new idea. It's an idea that Scheidel expresses very well and makes part of his argument is that the special sauce, the thing that made Europe so successful was the very high level of competition
Hmm.
within Europe.
Okay.
Just these states that didn't, and this gets to the title, Escape from Rome. It's all these states that were constantly warring against each other. But instead of what happened back in the 300s and 200s and 100s before the Common Era, where one of those states won and took over everything, they just got more and more powerful and continued to fight each other and continued to fight each other. And then in the 19th century, when they decided that, okay, we're going to come to a kind of stasis, let's look at the rest of the world, they just sort of instantly ate it all up because there was this period, say from the 1300s to the 1800s, where they just, okay, like we can't quite beat the other guys. Let's get a better banking system. Can't quite beat the other guys. Let's get a better education system, engineering system, military system. Da, 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 that sort
Do
of
they
thing.
talk about the concept of debt in it? Because I've heard about, like, on paper, like Istanbul seemed to be a lot more powerful than a lot of these European places. But because they could kind of throw around money that didn't exist, they could have a lot of armies from different countries, pay them with money that didn't exist yet. That meant they were much more powerful than they were on paper. While
Government
Istanbul was a bit like just trying to invade places to pay off its debts, doing things kind of a bit more old fashioned.
government debt is a huge the innovation of government debt is a huge part of that. That innovation sort of starts with the Italian republics, this, that, and the other thing, and then it comes to like full fruition with the Dutch. And yeah, Scheidel speaks about that specifically as well. The Dutch were able to defeat much larger Habsburg and then French monarchies.
Back to the Battle of the Boyne.
Almost there, yeah. There you go. Well, it's shocking how much European history comes back to the Dutch, because for a period of time they had the 80 Years' War, they call it. I think their war of independence against the Habsburgs, Habsburg Spain specifically, was an incredible time of innovation. And it's also, the Dutch are also central to this book because it's exactly what he's talking about is non-imperial, a region where an empire is never able to successfully dominate. So smaller actors are able to create, are able to develop in directions that are incredibly innovative for self-preservation, and the Dutch are a great example of that. And then the English become extraordinarily successful because they are, in part, at one point, they import a Dutch king, as we've been talking about a fair amount recently, are able to pretty much incorporate, this is with sort of the founding of the Bank of England and stuff like that, and exactly the ongoing system of government debt that
Because this was a great time of the mercenary. Like, it would be very common just to have like Germany's greatest horseman at just some random country's battle.
I mean, I think mercenary armies are certainly an aspect of this, but I think the birth of national armies is another. Well, I guess I suppose that's a little bit later. The thing with the Dutch and the British is that the Dutch figure out these incredibly innovative things. The British, which were nowhere near, either were certainly not large by the standards of, say, France or the Habsburg territories, but they were a lot larger than the Dutch.
Hmm.
And they weren't directly bordering on Habsburg or French territories. So they were able to incorporate everything that the Dutch did, and then they were able to take over the world. But that's just this sort of, that is also incorporated in here. So what Scheidel does is he says that, okay, this great divergence of the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s is really important, but everybody acknowledges that as part of this great divergence, what you needed was this competition between European armies. That's what was really important. And he points out that none of this would have been possible. The great divergence wouldn't have been possible without an earlier divergence. And what he points to, as he starts calling the first divergence, as opposed to everybody else calls the great divergence, he calls the second divergence, is what happened 1,000 years earlier, which was Europe having been on the path that China has been on for the past 3,000 years, having been for 1,000 years up to about 500, the year 476 in the Common Era. It diverged from the path of having a large empire controlling all of Europe, and it's
Hmm.
never gone back since. So that's how he sort of makes Rome central to the central historical question of modernity, which is, how did Europe win? And he basically says that, in fact, despite people lament the end of Rome, oh, wasn't Rome so civilized? This is,
Hmm.
Edward Gibbon says that the best time to be alive in human history was definitely under the four good emperors of Rome, or whatever. Certainly Mussolini, Hitler, Louis XIV, all kinds of European figures have idolized Rome and wanted to go back there. Scheidel's making the point that actually it's an incredible gift to the world, to Europe, to everybody, that in fact we all escaped from Rome. Because if one, and he actually goes, he's got a whole chapter where he goes through all the like plausible folks who might have been able to take over Europe again. He goes from Justinian, who was a Eastern Roman Empire in the emperor in the 500s, who briefly did take back a bunch of European Rome, and then that fell apart very quickly. Charlemagne, the Etonians, who were Holy Roman emperors, the Mongols, and that gets into a lot of that steppe stuff you were talking about. It's interesting. So the standard story that I had always, I mean, I don't believe it was just the standard story I'd heard, I hadn't put too much thought into it, was that the only reason that Europe wasn't crushed by the Mongols entirely is because the Mongol Khan died, and then everybody had to go back to Karakorum or whatever the Mongol capital was to decide who would be the next Khan. So, if that Mongol Khan hadn't died, then all of Europe would have been crushed by the Mongols the way that most of Central Asia was and the Middle East was. This guy points out that actually, no, that's not really the case. Like they were able to completely destroy the precursor state to Russia and Ukraine,
Hmm.
the Kievan Rus, because that was in the steppe.
Because aren't
That
Tartars of their descent that are in Ukraine to today?
Well, the Crimean Tatars,
Yeah.
sort of, yeah, from Crimea. Asian geography is always defeats me, and it's just that there's so much space in Russia. But I do think there's a connection between the Crimean Tatars and the Golden Horde. So the Mongols were incredibly impressive under Genghis Khan, and I think they managed to be somewhat consolidated under one of
Kubla.
his. Well, it was one of his sons. They were somewhat consolidated. Kublai Khan is the incredibly impressive Mongol who, I don't know if it was Genghis's son or grandson, who managed to
I
take
think grandson.
over China. And that by doing so, he became one of the most fabulously wealthy people in human history. But even by the time he had taken over China, the Mongol domain had already split. And the part that controlled Russia was the Golden Horde. And I do believe there are some connections, I can't tell you how direct they are, between the Golden Horde and the Crimean Tatars. But if we go back to the 1240s or whatnot, where supposedly Europe was saved because the Great Khan died at a convenient time. If you look into that, and Scheidel looks into that in this book, I'm telling you, Rory, it's all in here. It's a great book.
Okay.
The Mongols very successfully smashed the precursor to Ukraine and Russia because it was in the steppe. The steppe physically, like as a natural boundary, I think is much chopped up and made agricultural now. But back then it was, it expanded into Hungary. So they were able to take a lot of, I think they crushed Polish and Hungarian kingdoms as well. But then, like, the stepp's over, and you get into sort of river country, and the way that in the post-Roman divided control period, Europe was just this patchwork of every local duke had a castle. So in the Middle East, certainly in China, where I think the Mongols had to conquer at that before the Mongols, I think China was divided between two or three separate countries, but it was just two or three. And once Kublai Khan took those two or three,
They unlocked the whole kingdom.
yeah, they had all of China.
Hmm.
To take two or three dukedoms or whatever and take two or three fortified cities and castles would get you from like Eastern Poland to like 300 more feet into Eastern Poland.
Because the argument against that would be like all these small kingdoms have much smaller armies, so you can just slowly defeat one at a time. While when you're up against the might of China with its Great Wall and all of this, it's like you have one giant army to fight, which is less likely to succeed.
Well, I think that's a great argument, but the rewards for beating that one big army
Hmm.
are massive.
Yeah.
The rewards for taking down this city and then taking down this city and then taking down this city are very small.
Okay.
And I think, and by the time that, because it was only, I don't know, a 60-year period in which the Mongols were this like huge unified thing. So it was worth their while to take down those massive, incredibly wealthy two or three Chinese kingdoms.
Hmm.
It was not worth their while to go through the 500 petty dukedoms
Hmm.
of Europe. And that's sort of the point of this book, is that the fact that Europe wasn't unified helped Europe survive, helped Europe develop all the institutions that they needed to essentially build modern life for everybody on the
Not
planet.
to skip too far ahead, but is there like do they compare it to modern day European Union, which is quite a strange, messy thing? Quite often people go, "Oh, it's going to collapse because Hungary's not happy," while it feels almost like that helps it to be more flexible.
Well, that's a great question, Ray, and that is a question I was thinking about constantly in this book, and it is something he never mentions.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, but no, but it instantly prompts that because it's like, oh, well, if things, and I think that's so I love the work of Walter Scheidel. I love the work of Ian Morris. What Ian Morris did that pisses me off, that I think is it gets to the question of like, what is the contemporary relevance of all of this?
Mhm.
Does that mean that like Europe should never be unified and, it's better that it's not going forward forever? And I would submit that that's nonsense.
But is this also bad for America? 'Cause, it can go rot from one issue while Europe's so bizarre and all over the place that it'll only affect one?
Well, so part of the way that the United States is set up is to avoid that. That's why we have the 50 states, which, I mean, honestly, in some respects, like the 50 states are,
Or like little
well,
fiefdoms?
they're already more powerful than European countries in some senses, and that's consciously preserved. Trump is acting to squash that, but I sort of rebel in a more general way. This is why Ian Morris's book, where it's like his "I Love War" book or whatever.
Mhm.
That's not what it's actually called. It's something war book. I found really, really amazing and useful up until the last chapter, which I found very jarring. And this is something that I don't think is acknowledged enough in this work. Scheidel, I don't think he doesn't really get to it. He doesn't get to the modern day. Ian Morris does, and he's like, "Yeah, let's fund the Pentagon more." Seems to be his message, which is a very Stanford message to have. Is a very Silicon Valley message to have. I think the Industrial Revolution changed everything. And I think that's a break that I don't see sort of acknowledged.
The Industrial Revolution doesn't come up?
The Industrial Revolution comes up a lot in this book, but it doesn't, this is a book that's really, really concerned with why did Rome rise? Why did Rome fall? And why did nothing replace Rome? That's what he's interested in. He's
Yeah.
comparing, he's interested in the first divergence, his coinage, and what everybody else calls the Great Divergence, but he calls the Second Divergence, or the first divergence in, the 500s, and then the Second Great Divergence in the 1500s, the 1800s. Like, that's what he wants to talk about in this. So he just never really, and of course, the great divergences produced the Industrial Revolution, and that's something he mentions here, but he doesn't talk about what the ramifications of this may or may not be for modern times. It just doesn't come up, and it's not,
Okay.
it doesn't necessarily have to. Ian Morris does bring it up, and he says, like, "Yeah, what I said before is what matters now. War, war, war. Let's have more war." And that seems insane to me. I think that, in fact, what Walter Scheidel and Ian Morris are pointing out is, and they do, Scheidel agrees with this, the high importance of war, because it is the competition between these European states was always martial. It was always very much about war, is very, very important to development. The question is, what's important for development now? Like, have we uh, you know, all of human history up until the 1900s, there was nothing more important than a horse. And then in about 1910, horses became useless. And I think that the Industrial Revolution brings about those sorts of changes. The classic example is like, well, how can you be against war, Rob? How can you be da, 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 how could we have stopped Hitler without war? And it's like, yeah, obviously we needed war to stop Hitler. Obviously we needed war to stop Napoleon. But I think the more important question is like, what did Napoleon and Hitler get out of their obsession with war? They got stopped,
Yeah.
and they at incredible cost to themselves and to their countries. So yeah, you need war to stop the retrograde assholes who continue to want to wage
Well, I think
war.
you could argue Napoleon had a more of a beneficial, impact on history than Hitler.
You can make that argument, but I wouldn't necessarily
Mhm.
agree with it. I think, yeah, I mean, sure, like the Code Napoleon is good for some people, and he definitely had a lot of, he came out of the French Revolution, so he had a lot of more egalité. He did sweep away a few things that were bad and
Because
useless.
it did seem like he was like, "Get rid of all this tradition, let's start afresh." It is quite incredible what he did.
But it was, I mean, he also killed millions and millions of people. He was, I mean, I do not consider Napoleon a good guy, but perhaps I'm just too much of an Anglophile. I don't know. The French Revolution potentially would have been more successful had it not, in fact, become entirely martial and entirely military oriented, as it already had by long before Napoleon.
Yeah.
But Napoleon is sort of the guy who like rode that horse as far as it would possibly go, to Moscow actually, and then to a calamitous loss of life across Europe. And some would argue he's sort of how we got he's how we got the aggressive Germany, because he beat up Germany so much that Germany was like, we must go harder. And that's sort of one interpretation of where Hitler came from. I mean, we all know that it's Hitler's Woodrow Wilson's fault, but that's neither here nor there. my argument would be that all of this obsession with military activity is sort of like a historical hangover, because before the Industrial Revolution, the wealth of a state was all about how much territory you could conquer, how many peasants you controlled.
And grain.
Yes, that has absolutely not been the case since the Industrial Revolution. And, Napoleon was the greatest avatar of this. Then Hitler was the greatest avatar of this. And now the United States is the greatest avatar of this. Soviet Union in Afghanistan, Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. You win nothing by war. It is still true, as we're seeing with the Russian and the Ukrainian armies, is that they are advancing the art of war, and they are learning interesting things about drone technology and electronic warfare that could potentially have civilian applications and whatnot. But I would submit that, like, those benefits are dramatically less worthwhile than another 500,000 Russians and Ukrainians
Yeah.
still being alive. And in fact, while I think that certainly you can look at World War II, and like radar and cell phones and all kinds of interesting stuff came out of World War II technology, World War II technologically, but a lot of really interesting technological things came out of the Cold War, which never involved actually killing anybody.
Editing Rory here. The Cold War killed millions of people in horrifying post imperial wars. Rob regrets questioning this. What he meant to point out is that we did manage to avoid great power wars during this period, which would have killed hundreds of millions, if not billions.
And a lot of interesting technological things can come out of peaceful competition between states. The utility of war since the Industrial Revolution has exclusively been in smacking down the a-holes who were still operating through this historical hangover idea that we must have more Lebensraum, we must have more living space, we must have more land. And it's just not true. Like, you don't actually, and I'd say most of U.S. foreign policy is, for the past, certainly since the end of the Cold War, has been desperately trying to find a reason to go to war, to accelerating cost and accelerating failure. And what really irritates me about the way that not Walter Scheidel in this book, but the way that Ian Morris has used like a similar school of thought to reinforce this idea that actually war is awesome. And actually, I don't feel that, well, like, war was necessary or was central to development up until the Industrial Revolution, but I think we've moved beyond that, and it bums me out a little bit that these thinkers I very much respect and enjoy their work might not feel the same way.
Do you think this is incredibly self-selective? Like, what technologies is coming out of the Sudanese civil war? Like,
Yeah.
there's countless wars where nothing is achieved except
Yeah.
death and misery.
Mhm. I think that's a pretty good point. Unfortunately, I think that there are companies and militaries that do feel like they're learning something from the Sudanese civil war. I think that there was some of the drone technologies that have become so decisive in the Azeri-Armenian War, the Ethiopian War, and first and foremost, Russia and Ukraine's war, were probably tested out and tried out in Libya between 2011 and today. But no, I take your point and agree with it entirely. Like, it's just death for death's sake, and like the fact that we figured out how to kill people with drones a little bit better is not like a big win from warfare.
Because is it not
Um,
like a time when you almost just get the government going, right, we're going to spend a load of money on this and we don't care for, it's almost as if like we're not so keen on millionaires anymore. It's like, we'll take all your assets, we're going to take your house because it's nice. We want the army here. Like, it almost feels like they all have a singular plan to focus money. Things become a bit more egalitarian. Does that make any sense in a war scenario? So it's not necessarily the murder and the killing itself. It's almost just like you're going, we need this. It's really important.
so I haven't read it, but I think Walter Scheidel wrote a book, and it's been confirmed, or at least I don't know if it's been confirmed, but I know that Thomas Piketty has argued in a similar sense, which is that it's almost saying like we need a Great Depression and a war to deal with income inequality, which is
You can't just look at history books and implement what seems to be the best.
Thank you. Yes, yes, that's what we should do. We could, now, I don't know, do the tax cut and solve some problems without killing millions of people. But unfortunately,
That's not what Jeff Bezos wants, so
well, yeah, and then it's unfortunately that we have little academic support for that. I have neither read Walter Scheidel's book on that nor Thomas Piketty, and perhaps that's exactly what they say, that we should be able to figure out how to resolve these inequality issues without resorting to mass death events. Yeah, I think that's a solid argument of Thomas Piketty's second big
because
book.
that was one of the things about with the pandemic was a bit like, oh, it'll be like the Black Death, and suddenly workers will be paid more because there's less of them and stuff. And it hasn't. Well, obviously, we don't want a Black Death event, and it hasn't quite worked out that way. I think the current American jobs market is looking dodgy.
It's not as good as it was during the pandemic, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's not working out so great. But this book by Walter Scheidel is great, and it's a fascinating way to make your niche subject very important, because it prompts this really interesting question is like, well, if escaping from Rome was very important, like how did Rome come about in the first place? And it's just a great book. If you're interested in connecting the two great obsessions
Mm-hmm.
of history nerds everywhere, which is sort of Rome and European modern history. This does it, and it really knocks it out of the park in all of those, and also a ton of Chinese history, because like the second
But
half of this.
is it just constantly going back between like Europe and China and Europe and China? Does it compare to any other regions or?
So it's interesting because you could make an argument that like, oh, it's a little problematic that this guy doesn't talk about the Aztecs or the African empires at all, but it's he actually explains why it's problematic, or rather, because he tries to discuss Middle Eastern empires and Indian empires, but he mostly just cares about China and
Mm-hmm.
Europe, and he actually has fairly well backed up reasoning behind that. Is just there isn't the frequency of empire generation when you get far from the steppe. There just isn't. He does discuss both the Middle East, North Africa example and the South Asia, which is essentially just India, Pakistan, Bangladesh example. And it's interesting because he sort of puts them, it's like he's got a spectrum with China on one end, which is like constant pressure from the steppe leading to, and also the geography works out, and there's so many factors in this book that I'm not giving adequate weight to. China's at sort of one end of this spectrum of like constant pressure and leading to a very, very consolidated imperial area, and then Europe being at the far end of having no consolidated empires between 476 and the modern day. And then both Middle East, North Africa, and Asia are sort of in between that and have like a series of empires, but they're just a little further from the steppe, or there's a whole array of factors. But what's interesting is that like he does give them more coverage than he gives the Americas and Africa, but not much. And like the message is kind of like,
And no Polynesian or anything?
these folks aren't important anyway, because it's just
Hmm.
what's important to him, and yeah, I think it's defensible, is like, who are the folks who have the wherewithal to take over the world? And I think he's justified in saying it is kind of the folks that came out of this European complex and the folks that came out of this Chinese complex.
Does it talk about one of your favorite subjects, which is the British Empire?
It sure does. It sure does. We see like this, everything's in this book. It describes the process of competitive state consolidation in Europe, and then the Dutch get a whole bunch of things right, and then the British are a lot bigger and a lot more secure with their islands, so they take on a bunch of
Because there's
stuff.
another mad thing about European history at this time, which is they'll be in somewhere like the Americas and they're still fighting each other. And the natives are like baffled by this and thinking, well, this will wipe them all out. And then it's just like, okay, now we've beaten the French, it's back on to you. Like they seem to just keep fighting everywhere they go.
Yeah. No, it is. I've been reading separately. I've been reading about like early European colonization in Southeast Asia. I'm listening to a book on Indonesia. And it's just like, yeah, it's just awful. Like the Portuguese show up and then they get murdered by the Dutch, and then the English show up and the Dutch murder them too. And like the Dutch are also just like, they're welcomed very pleasantly by societies that are frankly a lot more sophisticated and uh, just straight up physically cleaner than the Europeans of that time. And the Dutch are just nasty savages, but they've got bigger guns on their ships, and it's all, yeah, it's all quite ugly. But it did, yeah, I mean, it is like Europe became this hothouse of warlike competition
Hmm.
that eventually produced some higher civilizational accomplishments, but mostly they were just really good at, killing each other and everybody else. And that did eventually, so the other sort of important concept that he refers to, which I guess is the justification for all of this war and death and destruction, is the Great Escape, which is we've talked about Malthus before, right?
Yeah.
He's the, I can never remember, was it Thomas Malthus or something? He's the British, I think he was like a man of God or a religious person who basically helped launch modern economics by sort of pointing out that, well, you get a certain level of population and then it's more than can be supported and everybody dies. It's, war and famine and pestilence are just part of the way of life, and it's how nature culls the herd or whatever. And the Great Escape is that Malthus made a compelling series of points to point out that actually it's impossible to get beyond a certain point of population. It's impossible to get beyond a certain point of wealth. And that all makes sense and still makes sense today. Yet he's been entirely disproven ever since he wrote that in like the 1790s. As we had 1 billion people back
Hmm.
then, now we've got 8 billion. And everybody lives at a higher level of standard of living than any French king of the 1790s could imagine. Well,
Hmm.
1780s could
But
imagine.
has
Yeah.
something not happened recently that proves all this very wrong? Because usually it's like more food, more people, more food, more people. So that's why places like India
Mhm.
and China have always had bigger populations because rice is just incredible. We're now seeing populations decline in most of the world, so we've got more food than ever, and we could make more if we wanted. But people are like, I don't need to have more people.
Well, this is another way that Malthus is being disproved. He was disproven already, because the economy just worked better. But for most, you're absolutely right. Up until the middle of the latter 20th century, we just kept on having more and more and more and more people, and that has stopped too. But the Great Escape, which is so important to Scheitel's book, is the fact that we did figure out ways to have many, many more people living much wealthier, much happier lives than we ever thought possible. And that is also something that it wasn't going to happen in China or in any other of these territories that are mostly controlled by larger, somewhat self-satisfied empires, because there wasn't that competitive pressure. So Europe did not just bring domination and destruction and better war making. It also, as a side effect of that, got polities that were interested in developing science and economies, and largely for the purposes of having better fed and
Hmm.
more soldiers, did figure out how to escape the dire prognostications of Malthus and many others. So it is actually a happy story that he's telling here, though it is an incredibly complex one. And I would highly recommend this book, Walter Scheidel's Escape from Rome: The Failure of Empire and the Road to Prosperity.
One question is, does he talk about like the dark ages of Rome? Because apparently they were a lot better than people have let on. Like we have developments like the heavy plough and stuff, or is it a bit like once Rome collapsed, everything was a bit terrible?
Well, yeah, he talks about all of it, and he talks
Hmm.
about that's like a huge, huge question
Yeah. Because I think a
for.
bit like the Renaissance one we did, like the Renaissance necessarily wasn't as brilliant as we have been led to believe. Equally, the Dark Ages are much better than we've been led to believe.
So I think it's funny. I think one of the guys doing a blurb for this is the guy who wrote the book that sort of was most recently formative and being like, "Ah, the Dark Ages weren't that bad." We call it. I think we now call the Dark Ages late antiquity. Is that sort of
Well, I heard it
what we're
was
running
originally
with?
supposed to be the first 100 years after the fall of Rome, but then that kind of got expanded to the last 1,000 years since the fall of Rome.
Well, there was a great podcast I'd recommend to everybody called the Fall of Rome podcast. Patrick Wyman has gone on to do Tides of History, which is great, but he initially his sort of like his first, and it's always fun to see like the first podcasts of someone who's going to be a,
Yeah, really
because
big.
well, coming out of the gate, he was really great. But he, of course, there's like, foibles and screw ups and, this, that, and the other thing. But he studied, I think he got a PhD in Roman history. And he talks about how the fall of Rome was so,
Hmm.
like, it really was. And interestingly, in Roman Britain, was one of the, like, if you want, like, in a single generation, people go from like living in this variegated, thriving economy where they're drinking wine from southern France and they've got other goods from Africa. And then by the time they're dying, they are potentially dying earlier than they might have wanted to. And like their entire world is their village or like their village farm. Like that actually happened in
Hmm.
Britain because there was a point during some civil war where they're like, yeah, all the soldiers come here to fight this civil war. And then they just never like
Never came back.
and then they just never came back. I'm like, so that's the experience that Britain had. I mean, Italy actually was, the empire fell in 476, and really nothing changed until like 100 years later, when the Eastern Roman Empire came rampaging in, and that actually was more of the burning of cities and the destruction of this, that, and the other thing. I'm so there's it's ridiculously simplifying to say that there's two camps where they're like, people were like, "Oh no, this was a huge terrible thing," and then other people are like, "No, no, no, nothing really changed." And I'm more in the "it was a huge terrible thing" camp, because you just look at population levels. And I remember I was reading Against the Grain by James C. Scott. Did we actually do a whole episode on Against the Grain
I
once?
think
I
so,
feel like we
yeah.
might have. It's a great book. It's the source of like sort of a meme that is very interesting, which is people pointed out that actually agriculture, which was traditionally seen as like this amazing thing that humans did, the first and all of the generations of agriculture before the Industrial Revolution, people engaging in that were like generally shorter, less healthy. You got a lot more people, but they were less happy people. And he had sort of pointed out about how like he was, I think, a guy whose sympathies were more with the freer, less regimented pre-agricultural or nomadic cultures, but he was just describing like what this process looked like, and he was talking about, yeah, I mean, these a lot of these people were better off under it, and he would just describe how like, there were these numbers are not the actual numbers. There were 1 million people here. And then 100 years later, there were 100,000 people here who were much happier. And I was just like, well, what happened to the other 900,000 people? And it doesn't mean they were all executed, but it meant that,
Yeah,
probably they
life was
just had,
harder, so there was just less population.
yeah, they had like much more tenuous lives and never got to have their own kids, or like, and they all just sort of, and I will never be in a position of like a degrowther or someone who's just like less people's better. And I mean, I think it's entirely possible that as part of the societal shift that we're going through now, 100 years from now, maybe there'll be 1 billion less people through entirely a natural personal choice, and that sounds fine by me. But like describing these historical processes where not
Yeah,
voluntarily there were like, a tenth as many people in Italy.
yeah.
Or it's not wasn't a tenth as many people, but it was, I
But
actually
something
did
like
look up
that.
this, it was
It was
like
a big
half.
dip.
There's like half as many people in Italy, and everyone's like, "Oh, well, that was probably fine." It's like, no, that wasn't fine. Like
Hmm.
there's incredible suffering that's just sort of being avoided there. So I'm actually more like, there's the class. Is it a Thomas Cole? Is that the artist? There's this classic painting for like the fall of empire, and
Hmm.
I've used it as thumbnails, and what a really, it's a really cool thing to be like a painter from the 19th century
Yeah.
who's become the meme for the fall of empire. Like, do you know what I'm
Yeah, I think
talking
I
about?
do know it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like I think there's a woman, like a
Hmm.
statue of a woman in a shield in the foreground, and then there's a burning harbor behind her or something like that. And like, no, like outside, I mean, there were absolutely cities that were sacked and it was horrific and everybody in them was killed, but that's not like the general experience of the
It's just a
fall
kind of
of
like, is it a
empire.
bit like Detroit? Just a bit like the city just slowly, there's less people there, less people want to go there, there's more crime. It just slowly, the energy's lost.
Well, okay, so that's interesting. So it would be like Detroit, except everything's Detroit.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
So Detroit is Detroit because everybody moved out to the suburbs, except those who couldn't, and they're
And the industry left, the motor industry moved abroad.
yeah, the fall of empire is like Detroit, but you can't leave, and
Mm,
you're actually potentially starving, or, it is really hard, things get much, much harder, or you're a urban, sophisticate of some level or tradesperson or what have you, who has to leave Detroit, not to, like, have a suburban home and an office job, but you have to leave Detroit to go out and start farming a plot of land, not really knowing how to farm, or yeah, so so I don't think that the stereotypical Thomas Cole Burning Harbor experience of Fall of Rome is accurate or whatnot, but it's just grinding
misery.
misery. And then, of course, renovation, like the individuals who, like those British individuals who in their lifetime went from drinking French wine to growing, trying to figure out how to grow plants, in their backyards, had horrible experiences. But a generation later, the folks who didn't remember that, were building something new. But I think it took periods of centuries to regain things that were
Mhm.
lost. So yeah, I am not a full Dark Ages. I understand entirely that we should have respect for the accomplishments of people who built things during these periods, and it was not necessarily that terrible. But yeah, I do prefer eras of greater sophistication, population, and wealth. And I don't think I'm going to back off of that. So.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us on a more optimistic episode.
Yeah, we're an interesting historical episode. Again, the book is Walter Scheidel's Escape from Rome, The Failure of Empire and the Road to Prosperity. Highly recommended. I've read it twice, and it's a really long book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.